The first time I tackled this subject, I looked at games that I thought were shoo-ins for the Sega Saturn, but ultimately never materialized. This time we will be looking specifically at games I wanted for the Saturn that were actually in the development process and then ultimately cancelled. Most of these games you read about in magazines at the time, setting the expectations that you'd soon be playing them. I've got 10 of these types of games, including one I didn't know I wanted until just this year. Sit back, relax, and get ready for games I really wanted for the Sega Saturn Part 2, the Cancelled Projects. Believe it or not, PlayStation's stalwart Namco had actually planned on supporting the Saturn in the beginning. Announced in May of 1995, Namco was going to release Sled for the Sega Saturn. This was going to be a port of their System 21 powered arcade game, a third-person arena tank shooter that focused heavily on multiplayer combat. I had been a big fan of the arcade version and played it quite a bit. The arenas had been built in a way where you could use walls and the general layout for cover and choke points, making the gameplay quite strategic. The announcement for the Sega Saturn was a big one with my friends and I, mainly because it opened up the possibility of, in our minds, of seeing more Namco arcade ports, such as Soul Blade, Tekken, Ridge Racer, and Air Combat. It had already been released on the PlayStation by this point too, which just fueled the speculation that Namco was ready to support the Saturn thanks to its Japanese successes. Of course, despite the project seeing a change to Sled Remix a year later, in 1996, Namco never completed it, and no footage has ever been found of it to my knowledge. Speculation is that with Saturn failing to grab any real market share outside of Japan during the 1995 holiday period, it scared Namco away from supporting it, and with PlayStation selling so well, they turned full focus there and never looked back. It's a real shame because not only was Sled a decent game, but it could have opened a door to so much more from Namco.
Ready, go!
One of the more tragic Saturn cancellations was 1997's Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. This overhead action-adventure game has you playing Kain, a recently turned vampire who intends to destroy the status quo of greed and corruption in the land of Nosgoth. The gameplay in this one is mainly hack-and-slash combat mixed with mazes, item collecting, and ultimately boss fights to clear the given area. Just about everything here reminds me of the first Diablo game, right down to the rendered sprites, the design, and even the voice work. It was developed by Silicon Knights, and the Saturn version was well known to have been in development for years, seeing coverage many times in gaming magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro. When it was released on the PlayStation, it was well received, and I had been looking forward to the Saturn release that was supposedly coming soon. That never happened, as Silicon Knights could not find a publisher to release the game. Neither Activision or BMG Interactive, the entities attached to the project originally, felt it had a chance at returning a profit with the Saturn market in complete freefall in the US and Europe by that time. The real salt in the wound is that the Saturn game was virtually done and just needed a final push to get it out the door. Some people that had seen the Saturn game with their own eyes even remarked that it ran exceptionally well. To date, we have never received any version of the game for the Saturn, though I'm sure a playable beta exists on some ancient storage device waiting to be discovered. Its sequel came to the Dreamcast a few years later, but not getting this one back then had been a real bummer since it was talked about for so long. Sports games were a real sore spot for me on the Saturn, especially in its first year. Sega wasn't ready with the software, and not having certain games when the system was fresh on the market had been a monumental mistake. Third parties picked up a bit of the slack, and one of Saturn's best basketball games had been NBA Jam Tournament Edition. So when it became clear that NBA Jam's successor, NBA Hang Time, was coming to Saturn, I was stoked to get in on that action. NBA Hang Time had originally been an arcade game just like NBA Jam. 2-on-2 ultra-fast gameplay using real teams and players. High voltage software, the guys behind the Saturn Tempest 2000 port were working on it, and it was slated originally for an end of 1996 release. There isn't any real evidence of how far in development the game got, but it changed dates numerous times before it was cancelled. This is likely another casualty of the Saturn's disastrous holiday 1996 season, when the Nintendo 64 nailed the final blow for the system in the West. With the quality of the NBA Jam port, I have no doubt that NBA Hang Time was going to be pretty good stuff on Saturn. It did make its way onto the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 that generation, and even saw 16-bit versions for the Super Nintendo and Genesis.
Gill tosses it with a layup. Incredible. He turned it over. Finesses it. Goaltending. Pippen, serious hang time. Is it the shoes? He turned it over. Time running out. The steal. With a hand in his face. And it holds out.
Some of you may remember the Raiden project for the Sony PlayStation. It was a combination of the popular Raiden and Raiden 2 vertically scrolling arcade shoot-'em-ups, and some form of it was apparently in development for the Sega Saturn. We know for certain that Raiden 2 was at least in development at some point in 1995, with a few magazines reportedly having seen it. Originally released in 1993, Raiden 2 was a big upgrade over the original. Better color, better animation, and lots more on screen. Cancellations like this were the most frustrating kind, as they still made their way to other platforms. You never got a reason for the cancellation either. They were talked about a few times in game magazines. Sometimes you were lucky enough to see a screenshot, and then poof, that was it. I really think the Saturn could have done this game proud, especially if they had given it the bells and whistles the Saturn was capable of in hardware. We needed a 1-to-1 arcade mode, of course, but then we could have a Saturn mode with enhanced sprites and backgrounds. Another one I really wished had made it to the Saturn. Electronic Arts secured the rights to the Neo Geo shoot-'em-up classic Vupoint in 1995, and began development on a Saturn version to be released in early 1996. Hearing that Neo Geo games were coming to the Saturn was big news back then, mainly because Neo Geo games were still super expensive, and the Neo Geo CD had yet to really give the world a lot of access to its library. Knowing that the Saturn had the power to do these kinds of games justice was exciting as well, as the prospect of getting close to arcade-perfect games was a huge boon in 1995. Vupoint had been a good one too, an isometric shoot-'em-up with sprites that looked 3D and incredibly smooth animation. It of course ended up coming to the PlayStation and even had a Sega Genesis port in 1994, but the Saturn game never made it out. This was a real letdown on a number of levels, mainly because I was hoping the Saturn version would trounce the PlayStation release and give the platform one of its rare wins back then. Electronic Arts would end up canceling a number of projects around the same time, including Wing Commander 3 Heart of the Tiger. I've never seen any information or actual Saturn footage or pictures, so it's another one buried under the history of the hobby, with little more to go on than magazine articles and press releases. You guys know I love Castlevania. I am a fan of the hardcore action platformers of the past, as well as the more mellow adventure games that would follow. When Konami announced Castlevania The Bloodletting for the Saturn in 1995, I just assumed it was what had become of the previously announced 32X Castlevania game, that never really had a name. Konami seemingly jettisoned that 32X material and started over. There is no doubt that Castlevania The Bloodletting would ultimately become Symphony of the Night, but the little information we have points to it being a very different game in its early days. Konami's brochure at E3 1995 seems to indicate that it was a more traditional Castlevania game, used a whip-wielding Belmont as its central character, and would feature 3D graphics of some sort. Focus quickly turned to the PlayStation version of the game. Things changed radically in its design, and the Saturn port was put on the back burner to be handled by a different team altogether. This combination of events led to the Saturn version of Dracula X Nocturne of the Moonlight, a not-so-elegant port of the PlayStation original. We never heard much more about those early days of Castlevania The Bloodletting, but I would have loved to have seen a Saturn from the ground-up Castlevania game all its own. That never happened, and all that remains of the possibilities is a PC fan-made game for you to mess around with. Let me be blunt here. First-person shooters were often not that great in the early 90s, especially on consoles. The genre had really just taken off on the PC, and the stripped-down versions of those games we were getting simply didn't compare. That's what made Killing Time so special, because it was an exclusive first-person shooter built from the ground up on a console. That just happened to be the 3DO at the time, a truly revolutionary game that mixed lots of story, full motion video, and voice acting seamlessly into its shooter gameplay mechanics. While more of a thriller, it had a certain air of foreboding and fear to its environments, creating a mix of scares and story. The only real downside was that the 3DO ran the game quite choppy, and there was extreme repetition in the textures of the mazes, something that hopefully would have been taken care of when it was released for the Saturn and the PlayStation in 1996. There are advertisements you can pull from magazines of the day showing Acclaim as the publisher. The date kept slipping until well into 1997, and before you knew it, it was never mentioned again. Even the PlayStation release never happened, making one think there was some sort of licensing issue at hand. I can't help but to think that there is an almost finished version of this game out there somewhere for the Saturn, PlayStation, or both. I think with most shooters going heavy on the action, this would have made a great departure with more adventure-style design. A real shame it never happened. For what it's worth, a PC version did get made and has a modern update with good old games. I hate to sound like a broken record, but a real sore spot for me was Sega's complete failure to deliver an NFL football game for the Saturn in the fall of 1995. This was absurd considering the popularity of their sports brands on the Genesis, and the fact that Electronic Arts didn't have a next-generation Madden that year. It meant the only thing we were able to play was NFL Quarterback Club 96 from Acclaim, a half-assed port that looked nowhere near as good as Sony's NFL Game Day. When Sega finally got an NFL game out with the Sega Sports logo, it was the atrocious NFL 97, leaving Madden as the only real option for serious gridiron fans. That was until Tecmo announced Tecmo Super Bowl for the Saturn in 1996, a continuation of the extremely popular 8 and 16-bit franchise. It was set for the summer of that year, and of course, just like so many other games around that time, we got no warning about its cancellation of the project. I have to assume it was extremely deep in the process because Tecmo even began advertising it right beside the PlayStation version as late as July of that year. Of course, that version would be released, but we never got anything official as to why the Saturn version didn't make the cut. I have to assume that because of the rapid decline in Saturn market share in the US, it prompted Tecmo to reevaluate the potential failure of its investment and simply chose not to finish it. The PlayStation game ended up not being quite the showstopper I had thought it'd be, but it still played an okay game of NFL football. The teams and players were there, and it had multiple camera perspectives you could play in. The Saturn was in desperate need of good football games, so I wouldn't have complained about it much back then. Tomb Raider had been a big deal back in 1996. Its 3D environments and gameplay really showed what polygons could do for adventure games, and the Saturn version was pretty solid overall. When Tomb Raider 2 was announced, I eagerly anticipated what core design could do with a second generation 3D engine on the Saturn. At some point in its development, Tomb Raider 2 slipped to the back burner for the Saturn, with the PlayStation version going front and center. I was hearing all kinds of reasons for this in magazines. Some said it was an exclusivity contract with Sony that doomed the Sega port, while others claimed it was because Saturn was simply incapable of doing the newly upgraded engine any justice. You then heard talk of Core wanting to use the 3D accelerator cartridge Sega was designing for Virtua Fighter 3, and it was simply pushed back a while. Personally, I think it was about the good old-fashioned dollar. Tomb Raider on PlayStation outsold the Saturn version considerably, and faced with working on the Saturn's complicated architecture again, or signing exclusively with Sony, Core and Eidos went the path of least resistance and most profit. It's really that simple. Looking at what was done on the PlayStation in the final version, I think the Saturn could have done this. 3D transparencies would likely be meshes, but I just don't see anything else the Saturn could not have done with some tweaking and hardware-specific coding. I mean, this would have been later in the system's life besides stuff like Power Slave and Quake, fully 3D engines that supported light sourcing. In fact, if Core hadn't been up to the task, I would have loved to have seen Lobotomy Software develop this very game. It could have sustained them long enough to perhaps see a brighter future. Retro gaming never ceases to amaze me. Between the community-created content and the stuff that shows up out of nowhere, there's always something to get excited about. Out of left field earlier this year, a Star Wars game called Rebel Strike resurfaced after being announced in early 1995 and being unceremoniously canned shortly thereafter. I had long forgotten that this game even existed, and upon hearing that a playable build was out there, I couldn't help but to snicker at just how bad this was going to be. And you know what? It really isn't. While far from being a complete game, you can see the building blocks of what could have been a decent 3D shooter. I mean, it handles well, has a bunch of different weapons, and the engine is pretty smooth. The Saturn of course received no Star Wars games of any kind, and while this was no substitute for the Model 1 Star Wars arcade, I still see loads of potential here. I mean, you add some level details, some more enemies, bosses, and mix in a little story, and I could have played this anytime. I can only hope that as time marches on and new discoveries are made, we will see more of these types of projects come forward so the community can experience them. Even when it's just a level or small piece of gameplay, the thrill is undeniable. Unreleased games are a hell of a discussion point. Often the only thing we have to go on are the ramblings of magazine editors of the time, many of whom just made shit up as they went along. Names, dates, reasons, whatever, often come with no real way to fact check anything. There are also precious few pictures and video of these games in existence available to the public, so again, magazines of the time are really the only source that many of these projects were even started. Is there a playable Blood Omen Legacy of Kain hidden out there somewhere? Did the finished Saturn Tecmo Bowl get trashed in an office move? The answer to these questions will likely never be known. The best we can hope for is that whenever somebody does find something, they will make it available to the community so that we all can experience it. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.